Story 1. I used to teach in South Korea, and one of my jobs was to help the kids come up with Western names to have with their proper names. I used to suggest a couple but left the decision completely up to them. It's their name, so they should choose it, right? One heavily bespectacled, incredibly quiet lad came up to me and said, "Can my name be Dragon?" And I gave the most powerful hell yes ever recorded. Story 2. A guy used to call me on the help desk I worked for whose name was 7, the literal number 7. He called often enough and we were friendly enough that I could finally ask him about it. Was that really on his birth certificate? Yes. Did he ever see that Seinfeld episode? Yes, it was based on him. Some writer knew his parents or something, and it inspired that episode of the show. He was really nice. 7. If you see this, you always stuck in my memory. Story 3. We live around reserves and see people of native descent. They have interesting and cool names, dealing with animals or actions like wolfcaller, hawk, or firemaster. Story 4. I have a coworker named Tiberius, and my dad had a student named Rush. The latter was named after the Canadian band and not the conservative shock jock whose best contribution was his death. Story 5. The coolest name I've ever heard and liked is Zephyr. It's unique, has a smooth sound to it, and means a gentle breeze, which gives it a peaceful and calming vibe. Plus, it has a mythical connection as Zephyr was the Greek god of the west wind. It's the kind of name that feels both rare and meaningful. Story 5. Iweoi. Boutros Ghali, Yo-Yo Ma, and someone I knew personally, a guy I worked with, named after his dad, Muhammad. Muhammad. For his middle name, he was named for his paternal uncle, Muhammad, and his third given name for his grandfather, Muhammad. Fully, Muhammad. I don't care to tell you about his cousin Ahmed. True stories. Not being bigoted. Story 7. There's a guy who plays for a National Collegiate Athletic Association sports team called, no doubt, Johnny Cool. His Instagram and other usernames are Johnny Cool 2, which is completely ridiculous. Story 8. I love Persephone and Callie Rose, characters from the Noughts and Crosses series. Persephone is originally from the Greek myth, but I just love the sound of both, and Sephi for short. Story 9. Gallowglass. Saw it used in a book and looked it up. Found it surprisingly appropriate for the actual character, but even out of context, it just sounds like a name I want to say. Story 10. My next female cat will be Kali. I came across a female character with that name in a book and just love it for some reason. Siobhan is one of my favorite names. I love the way it sounds and feels. Story 11. Took a civil service exam, and the guy above me was named Guy Blando. I resolved that if I ever faked my own death, I would come back as a guy with a wicked, awesome mustache and the name Guy Blando. Story 12. In a previous employment, I dealt with a guy called Sotiris Callicristus. I don't know why, but that name has stuck with me for over a decade. Something about it is just really cool. Story 13. Cyril, like the alphabet. The dude was such a cool guy too. I always thought it would be a great name for a boy. I also always thought Cyrus, like the Great, was an awesome name too, but I never met a modern Cyrus. Story 14. Oh man, this is easy. 48-year-old married father of 2 in the United Kingdom here. I was just thinking about this the other day. I worked with a colleague who was born in Poland and went by Eric. Loved working with him, best project manager I ever met. After working with him for a year, I heard him talking to human resources and gave his full name. Brother was called Arcadius, phonetically Arcadius, for us Anglophones. Full-on ancient Greek superhero of a name, Arcadius. Asked him if I could use his full name because it was spectacular. Best name I ever heard. Story 15. Megatron Bison. I'm guessing he changed his name to it. I never met him, but he worked at the same place I did. His name used to give me a chuckle when I saw it on emails. Story 16. I worked at a liquor store and had a regular named Rex Gunn. I thought that was the most film noir thing I had ever encountered, and if that guy didn't own a seedy detective agency, it was a huge missed opportunity. I honestly wish that was my given name. Story 17. Not to my credit because it was my husband's idea, but our daughter is named Holiday. Everyone loves it and it just suits her. I would never have thought to name her that. I was fine with Holly. I once knew a little girl named Rocky. I thought it was silly at the time, and then I met her and I cannot imagine her being named anything else. She was a stubborn, badass little kid and I adored her. Story 18. Ibanez Fontaine, a friend of my husband who did improvisation with him some years ago. I'm sure it was rough as a kid, but as an adult who was a hilarious improvisational comedic performer with his own style, I thought it sounded so cool. Story 19. I went to elementary school with a boy named Zygmunt, and we all called him Ziggy. Between the name and his personality, he was just awesome. I've wondered a few times about how Ziggy is doing. I hope life has been kind to him and that he stayed wild. Story 20. I knew a bartender whose legal first name was Hollywood. She was the coolest. She kept her ID handy because people were always asking her to prove it. Story 21. Seamus, so I met a guy doing tattoos in someone's living room at a huge high school party, and that was his name. I remember saying, cool name, famous Seamus, and then named my son that like 5 years later. Story 22. I previously did some call center work. My job role involved taking incoming calls from pre-existing customers and dealing with whatever inquiry it was they were calling about. I can't remember what the inquiry was actually about, but I just remember being really impressed with the customer's name, which was Max Corp. I remember thinking at the time that he'd make a good Superman villain. Story 23. Vikram Singh Rathore was the name of my uncle. Very brave. He served in the Navy. He used to tell me really cool stories about the sea. Some of them were even real. Like once, he told me about the Kraken and how it attacked their ship. Their captain fought the Kraken one-on-one with a sword and a pistol, buying time for them to escape. These were so real to 7-year-old me. One time, he told me about how he was dating this beautiful mermaid and how she really liked seafood. He saved her from this evil fisherman. It turned out it was a real woman he met overseas, and they actually got married later. Whenever I hear that name, I immediately associate it with bravery and heroism. Story 24. Used to work with a guy named Tom Gunhouse. Pretty rad. Nice guy too. He's a lawyer now, so if you're in the United Kingdom, you could be represented by Tom Gunhouse. Story 25. Guy with the last name Stain. He served in the Canadian Navy. 10 years ago, he was a master seaman. I bet the recruiter saw him coming and just knew they had to put him in the Navy. Never did get his first name or even an initial. Story 26. The name of one of my mom's friends is Celeste. It is a color, light blue, but it also means heavenly. Also, a friend of mine is called Sol, which means sun. Then one of my coworkers has the nickname Orso, which means bear in Italian. Story 27. 1. I will butcher the spelling, so I'll write it as it is pronounced. Manua, South African origin. My son is on a recreational baseball league here in the United States, and there is a kid on another team named Manua. His dad, a white American-born man, was a coach on an opposing team. I kept hearing his name called out during a game once, and I loved it so much. I walked over after the game and asked the coach about him and the origin, and I absolutely loved it. He said his wife, who is black, is South African and chose it. Sadly, I forgot the meaning, but I'm pretty sure it was something impressive. Emerald. There's ruby. There's pearl. Opal, amber, and I've heard and disliked diamond. But I recently met an emerald, a little girl, and raved to her parents how much I loved it. Classy, unique, but not too strange. Story 28. Dick Stoneburner, he also gave me the legendary quote, I don't need a crutch. If your beer gets warm, you're not drinking fast enough. When I asked if he wanted a koozie for his beer. Story 29. I am a teacher and one of my students a few years ago was named Farron. She is Greek. I've always thought it's one of the most beautiful looking and sounding names I've ever heard. I don't want kids, but if I had a daughter, Farron would be at the top of my list of suggested names. Story 30. I met a pretty good-sized guy who was about 6 foot 6 inches. He could have been a linebacker in football. He had a scruffy beard, and his nickname was Ogre. This was 2 decades before Shrek. Fit him, Story 31. I broke my leg as a teenager, and my doctor's name was Chun Bong Choi. It was fun to say, especially as I grew up in a small farming town in the Midwest and we didn't see many Asian people. Story 32. In my last place of work, there was a fellow senior manager named Knut Beekman. Knut pronounced Cernut. My line manager at the time fell off his chair when I told him whom my next introductory meeting was with. Knut. Nut. We were both European, me from the United Kingdom, Knut Belgian. But my line manager was American. Story 33. I work in a furniture store. One of the guys in the back is Joe Corona. A family was dorm shopping for their extremely tall and quite sweet daughter. Her name is Sequoia. Story 34. Once, I met a man in the United States called Tom Cocaine. I didn't believe him, but he showed me his passport. That was his name. To top it off, he was a high school teacher. He proved this one as well, and I was laughing for 10 minutes straight. Poor fellow. Story 35. I had a girlfriend in high school named Blair, and I always loved that name. If I ever changed my mind about kids, that's what I would name my daughter. I also had a friend named Dane Wolf who was a badass. Story 36. I met a lady about 10 years ago named Sage. I love her name. I told her it was cool, and she said she liked it because it reminded her of Sage of Halo from Ronin Warriors. That really made my day that she knew that anime. Story 37. Used to know a chick named Rocky. It was not short for anything or a nickname. She was cool as hell and drop-dead gorgeous. Yet somehow the name fit her perfectly. Story 38. So, I was very young when I had my son at 17 and really didn't pay attention to actors and their names. My son is named Keaton Michael, and he was about 6 months old when someone asked me if I liked Batman, and I was so confused by the question. I said no, asked why, and the person was dumbfounded when I still didn't piece it together. I told my family, and my dad, with the smirk of a man who has known the truth, just looks at me and says, "I thought you knew." No, I did not. Story 39. I really like the name Tainai. I want to name my first daughter it. My partner said no as it's too hard to pronounce. Finnish names tickle my brain in the correct way. Also, seeing English teachers trying to pronounce the YY sound would make me chuckle. Stune, according to good old Google Translate. Story 40. I went on a grand tour of Europe right after high school. The movie Eurotrip had an impact on me and my best friend. Anyway, after about 15 minutes of being in Europe, we met a fellow American, a few years older than us. He looked like the kind of bohemian dude who had some stories to tell. Long, cool hair, a bunch of patches on his backpack. Tall, muscular. You get the idea. The guy's name was Titus, and my friend and I realized, yeah, we're just a couple of short nerds. A Euro trip is not happening for us. Story 41. These two authors I absolutely adore write suspense thrillers. Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. One of their characters, Aloysius Pendergast, is a main character in many of their books, and there's just something so alluring about the name Aloysius. It sounds like a mystery all by itself. Story 42. I had a food representative at one of my restaurants whose name was Richard Hanger. Richard Hanger was hilarious. He always introduced himself as Richard, but his friends called him Dick Hanger or DH. Story 43. When I taught pottery at a kids' camp, there was a kid named Luke Savage. He was about 8 and already had long grunge-style hair, and I thought that kid is destined to be a rock star. My all-time favorite was my childhood best friend. Her name was Willow Forrest. At a doctor's office, I saw a Master DeAndre Pennycock called in for his appointment. Story 44. I've always loved the name Artemis, and I thought if I ever had a daughter, that would be her name. Until I watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and realized I could never have a daughter whose name I will forever associate with, "Hi, I'm Artemis. I have a bleached asshole." Story 45. My daughter used to go to school with the cutest little boy named Jet. He had black hair and a sprinkling of freckles across the tops of his cheeks and nose. Story 46. This reminds me of the Impractical Jokers skit where they read off humorous names in a lobby of patients. Maya Soul, my asshole, was a name a fan from the show ended up naming their child because they thought it sounded pretty. Laughing. Story 47. Someone once explained to me the benefit of having a last name beginning with AZ, or any of the last letters of the alphabet. They were able to show up late to classes because roll calls typically always go alphabetically. Granted, it meant he could only be late a few minutes, but for many of us, it could have been enough to slide by.